Tonight we have 4 stories, from an eerie story involving meteors, demons, a bizarre lake, and the infamous dogman. We have quite the lineup tonight. A huge thank you to all of tonight's writers. All of these stories came from you guys, the viewers. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. You can either submit it at my subreddit, r/slumberreads, or my email you can find in the description. It's your stories that keep this channel going. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I write this as a warning. Please beware of meteor showers. I know they're beautiful to look at, but they can be dangerous. I don't mean dangerous in the way of a piece of space rock falling on top of your house or crushing you to death, but that can be dangerous in its own way, I suppose. No, what I mean is that there is something that lurks among the meteors and their dazzling colors. If only I had known of the dangers, then maybe, and just maybe, things would have been different. Maybe my nephew Elijah would still be alive. It all began in the mid of the summer months. The news reported a meteor shower would be coming in the coming week. Though we lived in the city, it was said that the lights from the shower would be bright enough for everyone to see. I was excited to hear this. I mean, who doesn't want to see a meteor shower, right? I always heard of them or saw footage of them, but to see one in person would make anyone excited. I just couldn't wait any longer to see them. Well, it was around this time that my nephew decided to stay with me for a week. He would usually do this as I was the younger out of his uncles, so we would play video games or watch movies. Him and I almost share a brother kind of bond in a way. I mean, that's how I saw it. Not sure if he did, but nonetheless. He would come over if he didn't have anything going on with his friends. The summer also sparked the end of the first 2 years of high school. You see, he had just finished his sophomore year, leaving only his junior and senior year left. I took it upon myself to hold a small celebration for him. Not much, just order some pizza and gather a lot of junk food. You know, the typical high schooler food diet. What also happens the week my nephew would be coming, that is the same day as the meteor shower, when he finally came over to the house. I asked him if he would want to go outside and watch it that night, to which he agreed. The two of us spent the next 4 hours devouring the extra large pizza I purchased, along with playing a brand new video game I had just purchased earlier in the week. My alarm blared loudly, the alarm I set just as he arrived, finally going off. I turned off the annoying binging sound that came with every phone nowadays. I signaled him to follow me out to the backyard. I grabbed 2 of the chairs. He followed behind with his pick of soft drink and took a seat. I was about to join him when my mother yelled at me to come back inside and clean up the mess we left. I let out a groaning sigh. My nephew chuckled and asked, "I'll give you a hand, Uncle." I smiled and shook my head. I told him I'll be back as fast as I could. I ran back inside, having to deal with my mother being upset at the mess we left. As I'm writing this, I'm starting to wonder how it would have been if I had been out there. Would the same fate that affected my nephew affect me? Sorry. But my mind is thinking of the what-ifs, and only now, let me return back. I was busy picking up the paper plates and pizza boxes when the house started to rumble. My mom became frantic as she held onto a wall in the house. I fumbled a bit on my feet, but managed to keep my standing. Just then, a bright light flashed throughout the house, a bright blue, dazzling light. It came as fast as it did appear. Then I heard my nephew shouting loudly. My mother and I ran outside to see my nephew on his feet in delight. "Wow, did you guys see that?" he shouted. I shook my head and kicked some nearby dirt. "No, damn luck," I said with a soft laugh. "Elijah, are you hurt?" My mother, going into grandma mode and hugging her grandson. "Yeah, Grandma, I'm fine," he said, trying to pry his grandmother off of him. That night, I skimmed through articles online and on social media applications to see everyone talking about the shower. I hated that I didn't see it, but I guess seeing video and pictures of it would do me fine. Heck, at least my nephew saw it. Now we'll have something to talk about with people at school. I mean, who can say that they saw a meteor shower? No, I can't. However, I wish I didn't take him outside when I did. For whatever beauty brings, it also brings with it a sinister edge. I woke that morning worshipping my coffee maker. I watched the black liquid of life poured into my cup. My mother was still in bed watching showers on her tablet, a birthday gift from 2 years ago. Grabbing my cup of coffee, I made my way into the living room, hopping on the couch and turning on the TV. That is when my nephew arose from his slumber, staggering into the kitchen. "Hey, you hungry?" I asked him. He nodded his head, his feet guiding him into the kitchen. I followed after him, seeing if I could help him, as his eyes were still not open. I mean, I know he was awake, but it also seems like he was still asleep. "Hey, Elijah, are you okay?" My nephew opens the fridge, looking over all the items in the fridge. He pulled out a jar of pickles. He screws off the top, sniffing the insides. His eyes open up like lightning bolts, and he began to munch down on the pickles. I sipped my coffee, staring at him with a concerned look. "You sure that will be okay for you?" Elijah wiped off the pickle brine from his face. He gave a head nod. "Yeah, Uncle Ant." He walked past me, going into the living room. My mom got up to see him eating pickles this early in the morning. She gave me a look, to which I shrugged. Throughout the day, before he went home, my nephew continued to eat pickles. My mom even had to go out to the store to buy him another jar. I asked him when my mom was out what was with his need for pickles. My nephew shrugged his shoulder and replied, "I don't know, I'm just craving them." With that answer, I left it at that. I mean, I get it. We all get cravings for certain food every now and then. I watched him finish off the pickle brine from the jar. I remember that night when my sister came to pick him up. My mom told her of his strange cravings. But like me, my sister just chalked it up to random cravings. Yet after that day, my mom told me that my nephew had continued to eat pickles and nothing else. When he was offered other foods, he would sniff them and push them aside, only choosing the pickles. My sister took him to the doctor because apparently my nephew, only eating a diet of pickles, became very skinny, and his skin tone turning a greenish pale. Of course, him becoming like this made both my mom and sister upset. The doctor informed my nephew if this diet of his continued, it could have dire consequences. My nephew, seeing the sadness in my sister's face, agreed to eat something other than pickles. That night, he ate an entire steak and sides my sister had prepared. Everything was going good until my sister called, informing my mother and I that my nephew had threw up all his food from that dinner. He then became crazed and went throughout the food, demanding pickles. My sister cried in the phone as we heard my nephew attacking his father and throwing things about. Before my mom could talk to my sister, we heard a horrifying growl followed by my sister's own screaming. I rushed into my truck to their house, while my mother stayed home and called my brothers. I arrived at the house first, and just glancing from the outside, I could feel this sensation of death. At the front door, you could feel a rush of cold dread coming from the other side. I gripped the doorknob, turning it slowly. I was surprised it was unlocked, but when I opened the door, I came to see a horrifying sight. Blood covered the walls. Swallowing my fear, I stepped further into the house. An even more intense feeling of death and cold hit me. The sensation grew with every step I took inside. With one step, I seemed to step on something hard, and it forced me to stop. Taking out my phone and using the flashlight app, I looked down at what I had stepped on. I fumbled downward, letting out a loud shriek. To my horror, I saw the tore and ripped up bodies of my sister and her husband. What had happened to them? Where was my nephew? I rose back up, shaking the blood and other liquids I had fallen in. I continued to make my way further in, finding even more body parts from my sister and her husband. I held myself steady, not wanting to add anything else to the scene. That is, when I stepped into something else. This wasn't the feeling of stepping onto a body part or in a pool of blood. No, it felt like stepping on a ruffled up rug. I gathered my courage to look down. I jumped back at the sight of it. What I assumed to be a rug turned out to be skin. Human skin. Yet it wasn't from my sister or her husband. It was my nephew. His skin laid on the ground. It looked as if it had been ripped off like clothes and just tossed onto the ground. I looked around, seeing more pieces of his skin scattered on the floor. I followed him into the kitchen, where I saw the fridge door open. I heard a horrible gulping sound, followed by the toss of a glass jar to the ground. The jar clanged against other empty jars on the floor. I heard the scuffling of feet as a tall, lanky, pale green rose up from the fridge. Its body, human shape, but I could see the bones as if the skin had been tight against them. Its long bony fingers gripped the sides of the fridge door. When it turned its head, I gasped in horror at a horrible sight. Its lower jaw was human-like, with rows of razor teeth, but the top part, where it should have had a face, was nothing but a small mass of slimy tentacles. The strange creature bobbed its head, its tentacles wiggling about as if they were searching for something. Then in the deep darkness under its tentacles, I saw 4 golden orbs light up. Were these its eyes? As I stood there trying to figure out what this thing was, I saw something on its back. There were still remains of what this creature had ripped off. Or this creature, you see, which I still hate to admit, was my nephew. Pieces of his form body still lingered to him. I couldn't believe. No, I didn't want to believe this. This thing was my nephew. This was Elijah. How and why? Did he, or it, even know that he had killed his parents? Was he even aware of anything? The creature held up its head and chirped. It then returned itself to searching into the fridge. Food seemed like the only thing it was concerned about. It began to toss things out of the fridge. It rose up, let out an angrier chirp. It searched the empty jars on the ground, sniffing them and digging its tentacles into them to find at least tiny morsel. I saw that the jars on the floor had all been pickles. I guess my sister had bought them for him. I scanned the room looking for anything to defend myself with. I eyed a large butcher knife on the counter. It was stuck deep into a large roast. I guess my sister was preparing. I made my way to the counter, reaching for the knife, not drawing any attention to myself. The creature stood hunched over the jars, continuing to search throughout them. I had to do something. I mean, if this was my nephew, I couldn't let him live like this. Live. Strange to say, for I knew already this thing in this house wasn't my nephew anymore. Everyone that had lived in this house were dead. This thing in front of me, their killer. No sane person in the world would let this thing live. I gripped the handle of the knife tight. As the creature stayed hunched over, I made my way over to it, sneaking up on it. I readied the knife, and with a swift motion, I jabbed the knife into the creature's back. It let out the most painful, ear-piercing howl I have ever heard. I fell back, pulling the knife out with me. The creature jumped up, its body twitching in pain. It turned towards me, and I saw the 4 golden orbs stared right into my soul. Its tentacles rose up, revealing the top half of its mouth, and more rows of razor teeth. Drool dripped from its jaw. The creature stepped toward me in a jerking-like motion. It raised up its bony hands in the air, ready to pounce at me. I held the knife ready to counterattack. The creature let out a howl and jumped at me. I let out a scream, brandishing the knife forward. I closed my eyes as I did, and, in a swoop, I heard the creature's howl grow faint. Opening my eyes, I saw that the creature's tentacles had barely touched my neck, the knife in my hand digging deep into the creature's chest. Its blood spurted from the wound and from its mouth. I pulled out the knife and kicked the creature back. It fell down, its body twitching in death. I remember in that moment I jumped onto the creature, stabbing it repeatedly, until it finally stopped making any forms of sound and movement. Covered in blood, I rose up, leaving the knife where I left it, right in the forehead of the damn thing. I walked over to the kitchen sink and began to clean up. The blood from that scene rushed off me. 30 minutes passed when my brothers finally arrived. Their faces, the same as when I first entered. They found me next to the running sink, crouched down shaking. I couldn't believe it. I had killed him. My nephew. I knew the thing wasn't him, but just knowing it came from him shook me. How could my fun, caring nephew just disappear like that? Why did it happen to him? Then I began to wonder, would the same thing happen to me if I had been outside during the shower? Would I have the same fate as my nephew? To become some horrible, unspeakable creature? It makes me shudder to think of having such a fate. I mean, did my nephew experience any pain as he changed? Also, I do not have any answers, just more questions. Yet I say this to all who happen upon this story. If there should be a meteor shower, perhaps stay inside. This happened a while back, while I was living with my parents. At the age of 23, between jobs, I found myself in the mercy of an angry demon. At least, that's what I think it was. At the time, I had a girlfriend. We were hanging together quite a lot as she was living very close to my parents' house. Now, I'm a highly aware person. I tend to notice small things as well as the big picture. When the first incident happened, it surprised me, and my girlfriend too. She was a person with her feet on the ground, won't take bullshit from anyone. My parents' house structure is very branched. You have the entrance, an open space leads to an indoor balcony, and what was my brother's room and the kitchen. Ahead you see a corridor goes left and right. Long story short, my room was a passage to my brother's room to the left inside the corridor. And I was at a point in my life that I wanted some privacy, so a friend of my dad helped me with this project. We created another corridor with a door to my room. It was great. A few days went by. I remember it was in the evening. My girlfriend and I got back to my parents' house to my new room. What happened a few minutes after we entered was unusual to say the least. Bear in mind, my girlfriend did not have allergies of any kind. Pretty healthy young lady. So, we closed the door. We start talking about something. A couple of minutes go by when suddenly I notice a large bump on her forehead, as if someone hit her with a baseball bat trying to get a home run. It wasn't bleeding, but it was quite large. I immediately turned her attention to it, asking what could be causing it. She was speechless, and nodded her head saying that nothing out of the ordinary happened that day. As the minutes passed, the bump was getting bigger and bigger. We were very frightened. I decided getting out of the room and from the house altogether. After 45 minutes outside, the bump reduced till it was gone. We were pretty relieved. I tried not to put much weight to this, as I'm sure there could be a lot of reasons for it to happen, but when the second event took place, that's when I was sure. A couple of weeks later, in the evening, I returned home from somewhere. My mom was in the shower. My dad and sister entered a few seconds behind me. I remember I went immediately to my room. The door we installed was a sliding door, the noisy kind. I sat down to check my computer, chatting with friends on Messenger. The door is half open with the key on the inside. Hearing my dad and sister talking about bringing her to some place, and they left. As I recall, I really needed to go to the bathroom, but I delayed a bit. Only when I got up, I was shocked to find the door closed shut, locked, and the key is outside. What? I said to myself out loud, how can that be? Who locked me inside my room? At that point, my dad and sister had already left the house. I started banging on the door calling for help. Luckily, my mom was just about exiting the shower when she heard me screaming. Help me, Mom. Something locked me inside my room. Get me out. I was pretty freaked out. I never heard that door move. Eventually, my mom got me out of there and nothing worse had happened. But then I knew what I must do. The day after, I installed a mezuzah on the door which was missing. I kept postponing it till that day, and guess what? The weird event stopped. I wouldn't say I'm a very religious fellow, but I believe words have power over dimensions we are not allowed or still not able to access as human beings. My 2 cents. Having overcome the economic hardships of the Great Depression and extinguishing the threat of fascism abroad, optimism was something of vast abundance in post-war America. From New York to Los Angeles, a sanguine air had set upon the new global power, seeping in and assimilating all that it touched into a state of patriotic euphoria. But even with an entire generation pushing forth this exceptionalist sentiment, the intoxicating aura could not pierce through the dancing smoke of the cigarette, which hung loosely out of the window of that old army green pickup truck, which was headed slowly southwards down Lace Street. The radio played a soft jazz melody that evening as the truck made its way down the old southern road. The ground was left glistening with clear puddles, which remained from the light showers that had taken place that noon. The scent of the rain had wafted into the warm spring air. The storm had brought the forest to life. Earthworms expanded and contracted as they inched themselves forth through the waterlogged soil, and birds chirped and sung as they picked off bugs that the rain had flushed out. Having finished his cigarette, the driver of the old pickup, a young man named Franklin, flicked what remained of the thing out the window, and with a deep breath he allowed the sweetly scented air to fill his lungs. Upon exhaling, he felt as if a weight had been taken off of him. He felt confident in his decision, for if even the thought of being able to take his mind off of things lifted his spirits, then an evening out fishing on Boot Lake would surely buy him at least one decent night's sleep. This was something that had been a challenge for him over the past few days, ever since his wife had taken some time to go and see her family. Franklin understood why she would need time away from him. Ever since Frank had gotten back from Europe, The atmosphere of the newlyweds' home had been tainted by the nightmares that followed Franklin's service. Franklin's wife was a young, pale, freckled woman with dark blue eyes and the most beautiful wavy black hair named May. May had been an introverted person, but upon his return home, Franklin saw that something seemed off with her, far past her normal shyness. May had become withdrawn, reclusive, and uncharacteristically distant. Bringing his attention back towards the road, Franklin put his thoughts on hold. Inwardly, he became giddy as the familiar, little wooden 2-story building came into view through the dense roadside foliage. After a left turn just before the road that brought passerbys through, this little piece of nowhere, the hum of the engine in the grimy pickup faded as he slowly eased off the gas and gradually laid his foot on the brake. With the seamless transition into his spot ending, he found himself parked in the lot out front of a familiar little shop, long known to the residents of this sleepy little town as Bob's Shop. The first floor of Bob's Shop was the leading gas station and bait shop in town, and would have been the leading grocers too, if it wasn't for Milton's. Nestled further back in Belton, the second floor was the home of the Bennett family, the owners of the little market for 4 generations. Franklin had not just come for supplies, but also to pick up Bob. Ownership of the shop was always left in the hands of the firstborn son, who in turn, in order to maintain the title of the family business, was always named Bob. The latest Bob was a close friend of Franklin's. Having known each other since they were little, the brother-like bond allowed Franklin to see the inner workings of the Bennett family, which included seeing how Bob's bringing up. Bob was raised with not much of an end goal past the perpetuation of the family business. The result of this was an expertly consummate and comically passionate owner to be of a gas station, who was damn near dumb as dirt in just about everything else. Knowing this, Franklin's heart skipped a beat the night that he had learned that Bob had been drafted for service in the European theater of World War II. Despite already being aware, the Bennetts were visibly drained as Bob told Franklin the news over dinner that night. Franklin would have assumed that the discussion would have contained more mention of the family business, but it instead held only concern for his child's safety. Bob was the only one to bring up the old stop and what would come of it. His father chuckled at the insignificance of the station relative to the looming future. Franklin's stomach churned as a thought began to take root within him. Bob continued on a circular rant about how he would have been happy to serve his country, had it not been for the family's crowning achievement calling him. The conversation drifted away from Franklin's reality as his heartbeat took up a rapid pace as he made his decision. Even with his mind made, his perception of time slowed to a crawl, and his mouth tried to swallow his words to no avail, his pragmatic instinct fighting the decision in every way it could. Franklin had never thought of himself as courageous. He had often backed down in verbal conflict and avoided physical confrontation like the plague, but as the panicked prater reached its crescendo, Franklin forced it to a halt, along with the insecurities about his character, as the barricade within his throat gave way, and his words broke free. "I could substitute. Take your place in the draft." Franklin loudly interjected. The Bennett stared at him with a mixed look of gratitude and disbelief. As he exited the vehicle, he made his way up to the small building. Neon beer signs and soda advertisements littered the walls of the shop's exterior. As he stepped through the door, a bell rang, welcoming Franklin to the colorful cacophony of junk food and knickknacks that lay before him. "Franklin!" shouted Bob enthusiastically, shedding an unknown disregard what little voice and modulation control he had. Having been in his own world for most of the day and listening to the gentle pitter-patter of rain or the soft jazz rhythm of the ink spots for the time he was actually aware, Franklin gave a reaction one would expect from a man with a porta potty that had been rammed by a goat. Remembering his manners, Franklin somehow managed to refrain from letting loose a barrage of obscenities that could make even General Patton blush. He quickly regained his posture and went back about his business. "So, you got all your gear ready, Bob?" Franklin asked, tucking a case of Pabst under his left arm. "Oh, about that." Franklin's heart dropped upon hearing Bob's response, dreading what the rest of his statement would mean for the night's plans. After an awkward silence, Bob resumed. "Some stock shipments came in earlier than I thought they would, and they need tending to. Maybe tomorrow morning would work. About 8? Frank agreed, and Bob, trying to lighten the mood, suggested he continue with his plans. and gave him the booze on the house. As Frank was exiting the shop, Bob tossed him a pack of night crawlers, not considering the flimsy plastic container they were kept in. Having heard Bob's movement and the opening of the bait fridge, and having known Bob for so long, Frank knew without even looking exactly what Bob had done, and swiftly prevented the impending mess by catching the package. He thanked Bob for the bait and booze, and promptly left. Though disappointing that Bob would not be accompanying him, Franklin took some solace in the fact that Bob would be with them on tomorrow's trip, and decided to continue with the night's plans as Bob had advised. Getting in the old truck, Franklin set about his night and headed down the southernmost stretch of Lay Street. As he reached past the intersection, Frank's truck, and him along with it, jostled as the road transitioned from asphalt to dirt. Mud splattered up from the ground, and the sudden shaking caused the old fishing rod in the truck's flatbed to rattle. This portion of the road, the section past the street adjacent to Belton, was a bumpy old dirt stretch, one that Franklin had been down many times before. As Franklin progressed forth down the winding road, he reflected on the impact that his military service had had on him. He would have thought the worst of the stress would have subsided after his return home, and it turned out to be quite the contrary. He had been able to handle himself with ease relative to the situation he was in at the time, but it was as if upon returning home, the true effects of the war had finally set in. Franklin's focus had returned as he came upon a left turn and pulled into his destination, a small, muddy dirt lot filling a gap in the never-ending forest of lush southern trees, which surround the pond. Parking his truck, he took the 12-pack under his left arm once more. Walking to the flatbed, Franklin took his old hand-me-down rod and the handle of his tackle box in his right hand after setting the pack of worms on top of it. Franklin made his way to his old wooden motorboat, right where he had last left it, tied to the pole of the dock, which jutted from the land right up the curve on the foot of the lake. Boot Lake was a large pond which spanned about 9 acres. A decent portion of the pond extended westward, past the lots, about 2/3 down the northernmost point of the pond, resembling the shape of a boot, hence the name. The pond had been a massive staple of the culture of Belton, commonly being used for swimming, boating, fishing, and as a general location for community togetherness. People's boats, including Franklin's, were commonly left there as a result of Belton's tightly knit sets of neighborly trust. It was a generally accepted rule between Belton residents that a boat could be borrowed by anyone when not in use by its owner. Setting his gear down into the white wooden motorboat, Franklin wiped the small poolings of rainwater from the boat's bench, shook the water off on his hand, and took a seat. Starting the engine, he brought the boat along the pond to his favorite fishing spot, the ball of the boot's foot. Franklin took his time settling in, rigging up his rod, opening his tackle box, and taking a beer out of the 12-pack. After his fishing pole was ready for use, he began to reach for the case of worms, but then stopped. Looking at the sunset, he decided to take a moment to crack open his bottle of beer instead. After he leaned back on the bench, he put his feet atop the front of the boat. He watched as the sky turned to a vibrant blend of oranges, pinks, and blues. Rays of the dying sun's light crawled throughout the forest and wrapped themselves around the trees. With a soft bobbing of the boat, he was finally able to begin to clear his mind. And there he sat, sipping his beer and watching the sunset. It wasn't until the sun was just at the horizon that Franklin decided that he ought to start doing what he came out to do. As Franklin stood up, the blood rushed from his head and left him woozy as he lifted himself, holding on to the side of the boat to keep steady. Using the boat's side to pull himself up, Franklin regained his balance and went about his plans, grabbing his fishing rod and the package of night crawlers. Franklin picked out a large, glistening worm from the tangled mass of writhing bait. Dragging the resistant worm out of the dirt, the way a child would pick at his spaghetti, the night crawler stretched itself out, trembling as it reached its full extent, and then retracting, nodding back and forth about its new surroundings, occasionally tapping its head onto Franklin's hand. Franklin pierced the slender creature's body upon the barbed hook twice over. He winced as the dying animal quickly switched from an engaged curiosity to a panicked fluster of violent twirling and pain pulling. As Franklin pushed the worm farther up the hook, the defeated creature resigned itself to its fate, going limp apart from the occasional strained lifting of its front end. Getting over his feeling of guilt, Franklin gently flicked the rod outwards, his rig landing in the water with a pop as it broke the surface. It only took about 30 seconds for Franklin to feel a light tug on the line, followed by spastic zigzagging as the apparently small fish attempted to flee. But due to the well-set hook and the lack of strength of the fish, Franklin was able to quickly reel it in, lifting the line above the side and gently removing the hook from the mouth of the fish. A small bluegill, the fish bore its spine back in a flailed attempt to intimidate. Franklin lowered the fish into the murky green lake water, allowing it to wriggle its way to freedom. Striking while the iron was hot, Franklin continued to fish his regular spot. There must have been a large grouping of the fish as Franklin went on catching one bluegill after the other, along with a few yellow perch. Franklin continued for about 30 minutes, until the light in the sky was almost gone, as the evening slowly descended upon the forest. Deciding to try and catch something else, Franklin started his engine, and headed to the northernmost point of the lake, or the top of the butte. Putting on another worm, he again threw his line out. It landed about 5 feet off from a fallen tree, which came out from the forest, and landed partially in the lake. Fish had often been caught there, as the massive log provided cover from birds, and an ample feeding ground for all manner of fish. Caught up in his fishing, Franklin failed to pay attention to his surroundings. That wasn't until out of the corner of his eye, he saw a large, bulky gray snake slide into the water, and slither atop the water like a dancing ribbon. Due to the way it floated above the water, Franklin was able to tell it was a cottonmouth. Despite knowing that snakes are not aggressive unprovoked, Franklin decided to play it safe and avoid agitating it by giving the snake a wide berth and moving elsewhere. Taking a moment to think, Franklin decided that the heel of the butte was a good spot, as it was not only of sufficient distance, but also a common place to be able to catch bass and catfish who resided further towards the lake's center. And so Franklin put another worm on the hook and sent the line out flying like a weighted arrow when it pierced the center of the lake and laid in wait. After about a minute, the line was pulled and a continuous tension began. Likely a medium-sized bass, the fish, despite its size, undoubtedly had a fighting spirit, which Franklin suspected that the fish may pull so hard that it could possibly free itself. To prevent this, Franklin decided to cut the fish some slack, and upon half a minute after doing so, he felt the line suddenly stop and droop down, now motionless. Believing that the fish had gotten away, Franklin began to reel in his line, only to realize that the tension remained. The fish was on his line, just caught in something. Trying to free his line, Franklin found that it, along with the fish, were not going anywhere. Disappointed and more than a little annoyed, Franklin reached for his knife, the one the army had issued him during his service, so he could cut the line. The fish still occasionally twitching in an apparent attempt to free itself, but as he grazed the knife's handle, the line gave way, and Franklin promptly repositioned himself to reel it in, relieved that at the very least, he wouldn't have to tie on a new hook. The fish was no longer on the hook, and the only sign that it ever had been was the thick, dripping glob of dark scum, which hung from the line like a wet t-shirt on a clothesline. Franklin pulled the gunk off the hook, and thoughtlessly flicked it away, wiping his hand on the already mud-coated blue jeans after doing so. Having cleaned up, Franklin resumed his fishing. He cast his line once again, aiming near the center of the lake, though angled more towards the dock this time, as to avoid getting his line stuck again. Resituating himself into a comfortable position, he did not have to wait long until the bobber was pulled down. His heart jumped as he saw it go out of sight, and he instinctively reacted by pulling the rod upwards. In setting the hook, the line flew up and a wormless hook landed on the wooden floor of the boat. Feeling agitated, Frank put on a new worm and tried again and again and again. Something down there was taking his bait, and whatever it was very, very good at it. Taking a seat, Franklin kept a keen eye on the bobber, determined not to sacrifice any more worms upon a fruitless altar. Minutes passed as he began to lose focus, the night having gained complete dominance over the day, claiming the entirety of the now temperate southern forest. The previously concrete tree line became an amorphous wall of indistinguishable shapes. The sound of frogs calling out to one another slowly intensified, followed by the continuous chirping of the crickets, as the new default, only occasionally interjected by the odd hoot of an owl or splash of a jumping fish. But for Franklin, all was silent when he began to slip away as a result of the lack of stimuli. Memories passed through his head and he allowed this nostalgia to take hold. Franklin remembered the day he confessed his feelings to May as a teenager. Franklin remembered the time he and Bob found out the depth of the lake's deepest point, using a rope, and then measuring where it was last wet. 23 feet. But as he began to recall the time he had to stop Bob from diving into the water to catch a snapping turtle, he realized how dark it had become. Franklin was almost never out this late, even setting aside the curfew his parents had set for him when he was younger. The few times he would disregard their rules were usually to meet May, or to set out on whatever misadventures that Bob had thought of, and that Franklin had thought through. A good example of the latter would be the time that Bob had suggested they hunt for raccoons late one autumn night when the boys were entering their teens. For a long time, Bob had desperately wanted to make himself a coonskin hat, and having recently been gifted by his father the family's old double-barrel shotgun, he began to put two and two together. Franklin quickly dismissed the idea on the basis that a shotgun going off in the middle of the night would likely not go unnoticed by the sleeping residents of Belton. Elaborating further, Franklin explained that if they were caught, which they inevitably would be, that they would face a much more severe punishment than just breaking curfew. Bob looked confused, and Franklin, a political junkie to such an extent that he would occasionally be alienated by members of his more conservative southern community for his progressive views, often had to catch Bob up with current events to understand the context of the world around him. So he went on to explain that not only would firing a gun near a populated area be breaking the law, the gun itself, an 1890s era hillbilly hand-me-down, sure as hell did not conform to the standards of recently enacted NFA. Bob looked disappointed, and Franklin, despite being relieved by not having to babysit an illegally armed Bob, as he enacted his crusade against the raccoon kind, still felt bad for him. And besides, he kinda wanted to make one of those caps for himself, and so he found a solution. They would make 2 bows and a few arrows and use them instead. And it was a really fun experience, despite ending the nights after only bagging 1 raccoon. That kill went to Bob. Franklin did have a raccoon within shots at one point, but he couldn't bring himself to release his crudely made arrow. Instead, he slowly lowered his bow, unloaded his arrow, and then left. Since he was now an adult, it wasn't curfew stopping him anymore. It was instead the unsettling aura that the pond took when night settled in. It was as if the lake was a living being, one that, during the day, would embrace you and invite you to establish an emotional attachment to it, deeper than it just being a community gathering point. No, this was a vital member of the community, in and of itself, but at night, the pond would expect more from you, feeling as though it had established a connection with you through the day, and sought to extend that intimacy under the cover of darkness. The lake was by no means malicious, but it was capable of a violation of which no human could commit, the ability and inclination to show someone what their true perception of their inner self was, and the ability to learn what it was through how you reacted to what you were shown. But Franklin didn't want anyone to know, least of all himself. Franklin realized that the lake had pulled him away again, as he was suddenly pulled back to his senses by a forceful jolt. Franklin had never felt a fish like this before. If this even was a fish, he thought that it must be at least 15, maybe 20 pounds. But that couldn't be feasible, especially in a pond like this. Somehow the line wasn't snapping, just continuing to build tension, more and more. It seemed unnatural. Fighting with all his strength, Franklin was able to bring the fish within 5 feet of his boat. That was, until Franklin felt the strongest pull he had ever felt. It was as if he was trying to pull the moon down to Earth, and succeeding, but the motion was reciprocated. As if it was trying to pull him back, but despite everything, the water remained dead still, until the fish stopped. And there, where the silver moonlight separated the Vanta black water, red coils began to rise from the depths, as what seemed like gallons of crimson blood began to crawl throughout the lake water. Franklin quickly grew weak. Lightheadedness grasped him as he fell on his knees to the floor of the boat, where he shakingly grasped the boat's side. He heard the blood-curdling shriek of a whistle being blown shoot throughout the forest. Metal hatches were turned as he saw his brothers fall before him into the black abyss. He recalled that the only reason he made it out alive that day was because he was stationed towards the back of the landing craft. Getting up, Franklin pulled himself to his feet, sending the boat rocking back and forth on the black sheet of water. Letting go of his pole and allowing it to fall into the boat, he grabbed the line and dropped it into the boat with the rod. His eyes peered through the endless night, locking onto the pier, mostly by memory. As he was about to start the motor, his hands ready to pull the cord, he felt the weight of the boat shift. The anchor. Franklin could only see one reasonable explanation for the sudden shift in the boat's weight. Something was pulling on the anchor. Franklin turned and grasped the chain with both hands, determined to end this sick game of tug-of-war. His military training allowed him to bring it up in a matter of seconds. Even with the extra weight fighting against him, Franklin could see the anchor through the moonlit, illuminated water, about 3 feet away from the surface when the weight finally gave way. Glancing back as he started the motor and began to drive off, Franklin could have sworn he saw a pair of sickly gray, sodden hands release their grip and sink back into the inky blackness. Having reached the dock, Franklin didn't have to think twice about getting off the boat, trembling as he tied the old thing to the post. He then grabbed his rod and tackle box and ditched his booze altogether. The rain picked up again as Franklin stumbled forth through the mud-filled lot. He lifted himself into his truck and sped home, trying all night to rationalize what he saw. Explanations raced throughout his head. Maybe he just had too much to drink. His shell shock was getting to him. He was just really stressed. Wanting to confirm his rationalizations, and having already made a deal with Bob, Franklin got in his truck and made his way back down to Bob's stop at about 7:45 the next morning. Preparing himself this time for Bob's auditory assault, Franklin found the loud announcement of his name less jarring. "Bob?" Franklin playfully shouted back. "I'm all set to go. Got some worms in my box and my rod is all rigged up," announced Bob, proud of himself. "Just give me a minute to take inventory and I'll meet you in the truck," Franklin responded, already walking out to check his gear in the truck's flatbed. But there, on Franklin's tackle box, sat a piece of pond gunk. He picked it up and preparing to fling it, thinking nothing of it, until he saw something nestled underneath the dried, swampy green mass. He began to peel off the green gunk. A feeling of sickness washing over him, he continued to peel, and eventually, underneath all of the green foliage, he uncovered a few strands of the most beautiful black hair he had ever seen. "Actually, Bob, could you grab some ground beef to bring with us?" Franklin asked. "What in the hell do we need ground beef for?" Bob replied, seemingly amused. "It's a trick to get more fish. Meat is like catnip to lake bugs, and more lake bugs means more fish," Franklin lied. "Oh, you always were a good thinker." Bob complimented Franklin while he grabbed a plastic-sealed package of red meat. As Bob walked out with the pack of meat, Franklin took one last look at the clump of hair, and then stuck it in his pocket. After Bob tossed his gear into the flatbed, the two of them settled into that old army green pickup truck. As Franklin turned on the radio, a very familiar song by the Ink Spots began to play. "We'll meet again." As the two friends head down to the old pond, Franklin silently made a promise to never again neglect those who he loved. In truth, Franklin had not wanted the meat to catch more fish. Franklin had wanted the meat because when those two hands had grasped onto the anchor that night, the left one bore a ring that Franklin had very clearly remembered buying. I had an encounter with a dogman. I believe it was an alpha male. I'm only judging this from its appearance though, so I'll tell you about it and let you be the judge. First off, the encounter took place in North Carolina around the East Rural area. I've had several encounters, and so have my cousins, but I'll just stick to the most relevant ones for now. So to start off, and yes, I'll keep it brief as possible, I'm a 27-year-old male. I have cousins around that age as well, give or take a few years on about 3 of them. This takes place around 10 years ago. However, when we all lived together in an old house on the edge of the town with 3 adults. The mother and father of 3 of my cousins, and then my dad, sister, and I lived there too. And there was also my 3 cousins, Donardo, Ricky, and Sandra. So yeah, looking back on it, it was 3 guys, 2 girls between us. Our house, as many an East Rural area of North Carolina does, has a wooded area in the backyard, but a paved road in the front. Now with that done, we moved into that house I mentioned earlier around winter time of 2010, but none of the activity started until spring next year. It first began with us seeing large black wolves around the trash can when it would start filling up with our garbage. I don't want you to think this is an instant type of encounter, but rather a over the years or months type of thing. This snooping around the trash cans lasted about a month or so, before we started seriously looking into it. At first we thought it was natural, and something we just had to accept by living in the countryside. We later noticed that in our area, there should only be red wolves, the smaller of the wolves between the gray and itself, and basically, there should not be any wolves the size of black bears on our property, or anywhere. So, as typical scared human fashion, we armed up and soon amassed a gun collection the rest of that week that would make the proudest of the proud rednecks jealous. Next, when we saw the wolves come back one day, we snuck around to the front yard with our rifles and took arm over the fence, separating the backyard from the front on the side of the house. They all had their backs turned to us, but ears turned backwards as they tore through the garbage. Then the three of us took aim, me, Ricky, and DiNardo. Ricky whispered lightly, "On 3. And after he whispered that, one of the wolves did something unthinkable. You probably guessed it. This motherfucker stood on 2 legs and turned to face us. By the expression on its face, I got the feeling it was fully aware the whole time that we were there. It had its amber eyes lowered in an intelligent, cold, calculating way. Mouth or snout closed. It felt like he was saying to us, "Shoot, human. Give me a reason for us to tear you apart." Well, I know it sounds crazy, but that's the feeling I got from it in those few seconds it stood up and faced us. This went on for about 30 seconds altogether. While it was facing us, the 2 other wolves, but not by much, honestly, paid us no mind while they continued to search through the garbage. And yeah, we all froze in fear. It's like our worlds were shattered by this thing standing upright. He wasn't jumping in the air like Fido for a little treat. He just stood, stared us down before he did a low growl. I don't know how to describe it. We didn't shoot anything that day. Ricky later said we might not have a firearm in our collection that could stop it from that range, or if at all. When the wolf stood up on 2 feet, he was nearly 7 feet tall and looked at the time 400 or so pounds of muscle. However, this was just the first encounter with this specific wolf. Over the course of 3 more years, he got even larger. But I'll come back to that in a second. After we went back in the house, the wolf, dogman, or whatever, went back to all 4s and continued what it was doing with 2. Ricky and DiNardo's mother told us that she felt the kitchen table vibrate a few minutes ago. The cabinets too. She asked us if we knew anything about it. We told her it was a big hoss outside, the nickname we gave it. She looked out the window and they were all in the process of leaving. She said, "Oh fuck, not again." Then I guess she saw the firearms we just had and asked us why we didn't shoot it. I don't think any of us had a real answer, but she's gun illiterate, so we just made up some bullshit about all the guns jamming at the same time, or something like that, and called it a day. My dad and my cousin's dad both worked night shifts, and usually slept through the day while Ricky had a day shift, and me and DiNardo, along with my sister and Sandra, all didn't have jobs at the time. But what I'm saying is that dealing with the wolves coming too close to the house was the 5 of us' responsibility. One time DiNardo and his dad had a hilarious argument. That had his dad saying, "I provide all the food in the house. The least you can do is make sure some big-ass wolf don't tear me apart while I sleep." I don't know. It's just the way he delivered it which made me fall out of my chair laughing. He had spit and all that flying out of his mouth and held his hands up, presenting it, while his head swung with each word. But what wasn't funny was how over the next few months it didn't stop. We tried several times to ambush the dog trio, but every time we would get a good vantage spot, top floor of the attic, top floor bathroom, side of the house, wherever we could aim a rifle out the window, he would just stop what he was doing and face our exact direction with the same stare he gave us last time. I put 2 and 2 together and came to the conclusion that if it's a dog creature, then it's obvious he would have our scent by now. He knew exactly where to look every single time. He didn't need to turn his head or squint his already lowly held eyes, or turn his neck to try and see us. No. He knew exactly where we were every single time. Sometimes Sandra and my sister would be with us as well, so I guess he got their scent too now. It would mentally shake us up whenever he would do this too. We just couldn't pull the trigger every single time. None of us felt confident we could put it down with a clean shot, and if we wounded it, then who's to say it wouldn't want revenge? It's not going to stand there and wait to be shot again. To be honest, I don't think he considered us a threat anymore after we chickened out the first time we had our encounter. That, or he simply did not care about us, per se, but did care about the challenge to his authority we presented. On the flip side of things, after the months went by of this dogman trio visiting the side of the house for our trash, nobody was injured. They were scary as hell to look at, but if he knew where we were at all times, then he could have easily kicked the door down and dragged us out one by one, is how we figured it. So what's the point? They didn't have a set time they came by. It was just always during the daylight. Yes, I said daylight. Werewolf theory debunked, right? Anyhow, a year of this went by, and life went on as normal. Then the months started going by after that, all with no attacks in our family. The 5 of us made the conclusion that if we leave them alone, they'll leave us alone. They lost interest after a while, but I didn't. I waited every time by the kitchen window for them to come by. I had my phone, and YouTube, and etc., but I made sure to keep an eye on them. And over time I saw Big Hoss's coat change from all black shaggy fur to having lighter silver fur develop on his back. He looked about 8 or 9 feet tall now, and 700 plus pounds as well. Pure muscle. And no, he was not taking any form of shit from anybody. He was ready to metaphorically go at moment's notice, like some kind of super dog soldier man beast. I know I kind of trailed off there for a minute, but it's also the aura I felt around him now. It's not like he sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and told me, "I'll bite your fucking head off literally. Don't test me, human." But just to put things in a better perspective, our living conditions were like this now, around the house. Stay out of his way, don't piss him off, and maybe, just maybe, he won't come to any harm. It was all we could hope for at this point. What could we do? Call the police and they sent a trooper out here with his little pistol? We had semi-automatic rifles in our collection, and Ricky never thought it was enough to put the creature down, no matter what we all thought or wanted to think. That's how it remained. Also, he didn't care about me watching the trio from the kitchen window, or even taking videos and pictures of them while they were there. But yeah, since then, dropped phone in water and it died and all that. Got a new one after we moved though. We stayed at that place for about 2 years before we moved in 2013. One day in the summertime, on a hot night, we heard a howl outside, and we all instantly froze in fear like, oh shit, they must be tired of garbage now. Of course, none of us said that, but that's what we were all feeling. We all knew that it had to be them. No wolves other than the trio's pack were in the forest. Sometimes, we would see a single wolf by himself, or herself, just playing with its tail like a normal puppy would. This pup could tear us limb from limb, without much effort, but nonetheless, it felt a need to play. I don't know what it was doing, but I saw others too. Packs of 2s roaming the forest, packs of 5, 8, or however many there were. All of them seen in the daytime. There was no reason for them to be here at night unless they wanted something new. I suppose the pack was growing too large for its normal meals. But yeah. We looked outside through the living room curtains, and as soon as we pulled them back, staring right at us was a dogman. It didn't look anything like the others though. This one was a lighter brown, spotted, and had red eyes opposed to the amber. This son of a bitch was right in the window. Not a few feet snooping around sniffing the air, or anything, but had its snout pressed against the window when we pulled back the curtains. I don't know what it was, but I started smelling piss. Someone actually did piss themselves, and for all I knew, could have been me. We all instantly jumped back at the sight of the creature, while Ricky and my dad, along with my cousin's dad, who were both woken up by the howl, started passing out guns. We didn't go back near the window, but we did take another look at the creature, and his pack was behind him. They looked like overgrown coyotes, with spots, all of them. This was absolutely not Big Hoss's pack. We've never seen these wolves before, and it dawned on me that this could be the reason the Big Hoss's pack is out during the day. They give these guys the night while they take the daylight. But why haven't they attacked us sooner than this? Unlike the other wolves who didn't care if we lived or died on the property, this wolf here seemed to take very much care. I got the feeling it saw us as food, maybe even a demonic presence as well. It stood there at the window for about 5 minutes watching us get armed before it moved. What did it do, you ask? It smashed the window with the overly exaggerated hand gesture, of course. It paused after shattering the window with its light tap punch. We all unleashed hell on it, hitting it square in the chest, head, wherever it was exposed we aimed, and fired from behind a couch. What happened next was like a scene from hell itself, because it went down. It fell backwards like a tree falling, but the other wolves remained behind it staring. We thought we had killed it for nearly 30 seconds, before it rose back up the way it fell down, but this time it watched us with a sick grin on its face. It could have been showing its teeth, or that thing that dogs usually do that resembled grinning. I don't know, to be honest. We all fired again at it, but this time, it just closed its mouth and stood there. It's like it was telling us that it was only just humoring us before, and in fact, we were nothing. While still under fire, it then sprung itself inside the house through the window, in a jerking fast motion as if it practiced the stunt 300 times before. It stood 8 or 9 feet tall, just like Big Hoss. It reminded me of him, only in size alone. This one looked a lot leaner and more agile, but after it got inside, I lost the thought I had earlier about it being demonic. It just looked feral now, like a hungry wolf pack would look, but it didn't matter if it was a demon or flesh and blood creature fighting to survive, because we were about to be the prey for the pack. Our ammo was running out by then, and this thing still wasn't going down. Please understand, none of us are military. None of us knew what a firearm looked like before we moved to this house. I know we missed a lot of the shots we fired, but I'm positive at least 3, maybe 4 shots hit the thing after it stepped inside. It took a step closer towards us before it stopped and turned its head out the window and started growling. Then the pack behind it followed suit and moved from their seated positions to 2 feet battle stances. It turned its head back towards us before it jumped back out the window and howled. It was immediately met with another howl from the tree line. I remember seeing Big Hoss stepping forward out of the dark with his wolves behind him. The lighter shade, red-eyed dogman instantly dashed towards him and closed the distance in maybe 5 seconds at most. It slashed Hoss on the side of the neck, but for whatever reason, it didn't open him up like I thought it did. It might have bled, but it didn't drip any blood from what I saw. But by then, Big Hoss was ready to pay him back and took a swing, which looked like a haymaker from a human's perspective, at the other dogman, and instantly the 2 packs started brawling right in the backyard. I even saw one of the dogmen in both the packs fall from injuries they sustained from one another. My sister made the snap decision that we should leave in the truck and stay at a hotel for tonight, and come back in the morning. I think the lighter dogman dodged Hoss's first blow, but it looked like he caught him with a follow-up combo swipe across its chest. It still didn't go down though, and they continued the brawl as we all got inside the truck. We had gathered up whatever ammo we had left, and went out the front door, putting 3 of us in the back with loaded rifles, while the rest sat in the front, and Dad drove us out of there. When we got back the next morning, there wasn't a single carcass to be found. Blood everywhere, and the side of the house is all scarred up with 5-point claw indents on the walls, but it was still standing nonetheless. Even with significant damage and blood and fur everywhere, no body of the dogman was seen. What we did see though, when we looked out the kitchen window, was the trio in the garbage again, with the boss man looking our direction, and standing on 2 feet with its arms pointing at the back of the house, before losing interest and going through the garbage again. We waited until they left before we looked at the back of the house from the yard, and written in blood was the single word "gone," written in horrible handwriting. Since we did continue to see Big Hoss's pack around the following months, we assumed he meant the lighter shade dogmen were driven out of the area, and I still don't think he gave a damn if we figured it out or not. But who knows what's going through the mind of Big Hoss, the dog boss. Hey everyone, I hope you guys enjoyed the stories. There was definitely some really interesting ones tonight. I never thought that I would read a scary story detailing Pickles, but here we are. KaijuWriter is an incredible author. He's submitted many stories in the past. If you guys remember the Mr. Sano story or the Friend story from my Evil Entity video, he wrote both of those as well. Definitely a very interesting twist. Then we had the demon story. I don't even know what to say about that one. That was a really interesting one. I think that story was supposed to be true as well, so definitely an eerie one to say the least. Then we had the Bottom of Boot Lake. That was a really, like, serene story to narrate. I really enjoyed that one quite a bit. The twist at the end was not something I saw coming whatsoever. And then, of course, you can never go wrong with the Dogman story, right? Can never go wrong with the Dogman story. You know, I think that's like the second story I've narrated where the Dogman actually turned out to be a good guy. So, I mean, all he wanted was some food. That's it. That's all he wanted. But I guess that's the end of the video. I'll be catching you guys in a few days with another one. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. Good night, everyone. I'll talk to you later.